Orthopedic surgeon by training, and trained at Harvard, and for many years was clinically oriented, and now has been for actually over the past almost 2 years now. How long has it been? Just 1 year. Okay, so usually.
Over a year.
Okay, only over. Okay, well, in any event, she is the Chief Medical Officer for Applied VR, and I've asked her to talk about the experiences bringing a product to market, the trailblazing and the regulatory pathway. This is an area that has come up over and over again in these discussions. Is we do all this great work, amazing research from the laboratory. We just saw, how do we bring this to market? How do we get this into the hands of patients who need this software? So thank you for being with us today.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon. You know, when I got this invitation, I was like, how do you end a conference talking about the regulatory landscape? So I'm going to try to give you a high-level understanding of, through storytelling, so through the eyes of AVR and its path, but also giving you the rules and sort of the lay of the land and some things that you need to think about and when you need to think about them. So I have a couple disclosures. I'm an employee of Applied VR. I have equity holdings in Applied VR, but this talk is not intended to promote, endorse, or market products or services of Applied VR. I have one more disclosure. I'm breaking a lot of rules on the PowerPoint rule list because there's some busy slides in here because I was told that these would be made available to you afterwards. And so some of the things that you're going to hear will be like Charlie Brown's teacher, wah, 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 and you'll want to read them later. So I put them on the slide. So let's talk about what happens after breakthrough. But I think we have to go first to what's MXR. What is that? To regulators, it's all of these things, all the things that you've been interacting with at this conference. But they all get touched and interpreted differently by the regulators. They all have a different set of rules when it comes to can it do what you say it will do, and will the FDA, for the United States only, endorse it? Ooh, that was a bad word, because they don't endorse. They clear, they authorize, or they approve, but they don't endorse. So we don't need that, because you have that. So what I want to say is life before breakthrough. And you keep hearing about breakthrough, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. But in your company or with your idea, do you want to be regulated or not? That's a big deal because you cannot pretend to be regulated. You either are or you're not, and you have to follow the rules. So that, for the United States, that's governed by the FDA for medical devices. Around the globe, there are other jurisdictions and commissions, and also so the rules change as you go around the world. So you have to decide kind of early if you're just going to be in the United States, marketed in the United States, or if you're going to try to be global, because some of this you have to think about long before it's ever become a reality. And then you have to decide, do you want to be a medical device or do you want to be a wellness application? And that's a big deal because you can't play. It's kind of like that playing pregnant because you can't do it. And being defined by the FDA is being a medical device is any instrument, machine, contrivance, implant, in vitro reagent that is intended to treat, cure, prevent, mitigate, or diagnose disease in man. So if you do any one of those things, you're a medical device. And so what's breakthrough? What does that mean? It's a designation, and it's a voluntary program that was set up to try to accelerate innovative products to the market. That's basically what all those words are. That timely access, because by the end of this talk, you're going to laugh when we talk about timely access. And that speeding up development, you're going to laugh about that too. And the assessment and review. But that is just a designation. That is just a title. So does obtaining breakthrough designation mean your FDA approval? Anybody got an idea? Nope. Sure doesn't. That's just the first step. So it's kind of a leg up when you go through the process. It gets you not all the way to the front of the line, but it gets you closer than some others. So people on the review panels look at you differently when you have this designation. They also want to help you more. But does that designation really help? So 760 devices were granted breakthrough designation, and only 8% of them actually got cleared to be marketed. So it's still a process, and that's what I want you to understand. So we all throw up our hands and we're saying, oh, yay, we got breakthrough designation. But it really isn't the party favor that you think it is. So what I will do and hope to do and share with you is one pathway. Because with breakthrough, usually it's about an innovative product. It's something that has not made it to the market, but the FDA considers will considerably impact the lives of patients. And so it's important that we get it out there. And so there's different processes that you go through. And the one that AVR went through is called de novo. And that just means new. It has not been done before. And what it does is it defines how the FDA will then consider, assess, and review your market application. The other thing that many of you may have heard of is what's called the 510K process. And that happens after there's already a product on the market that looks similar to yours. So you can say, my thing is going to be okay because this thing that you already said was okay is okay, and they're kind of the same. That's the 510K process. But the de novo process is one that you have to shape all the rules. Okay, that's really important because I think any of you that are entrepreneurs, you're not entrepreneurs just for charity, right? You want to have a commercial organization, right? So you want to have a competitive advantage. The de novo process helps you to define that because once it is authorized, because that's what happens with de novos, they get authorized. Once a de novo is authorized, it then becomes the predicate, the things that other people can follow in the 510K process. So the next person that comes along doesn't have to do a 510K. Doesn't have to do a de novo, has to do a 510K. And so the de novo, you get some special rights in there. You get to write the rules for how things are tested, how things are validated, what kind of clinical, if you were required to produce clinical evidence, what kind of clinical evidence, the depth and the specificity of those trials, and those are called special conditions, and everybody that follows you has to follow the rules that you made up. So de novo is kind of sexy in the competitive landscape sort of way. Now, FDUFA, has anybody ever heard that before? Federal Device User Fee Amendments. And that's the rule that helps the FDA get money to hire people to review applications for all of these innovations. And so to incentivize them to move the process faster, they said that all these applications, the new applications, should be reviewed within 120 days. Well, a day is not a day to the FDA. So you have to, when they say 120 days, okay, put your tongue in your cheek because it's really not 120 days. But they are based on calendar days. So the weekends are included when you do that. But there's these things like refusal to accept. So when you send your packet in, if there's anything wrong with it, you didn't follow the rules, and now they have a new electronic application system, which is not great. And if you miss some of the steps, you get this refusal to accept. So your clock doesn't even start yet because they haven't accepted it. So even though it sat there for 7 days, your clock hasn't started, all right? And this is reset to 0 each time the company receives a refusal to accept hold letter. So clock starts over. So see how that 120 doesn't really seem like 120? But it gets better because it gets longer. So even after it is finally just accepted in the door, they review it, and if they have a question, guess what? The clock stops again because you have to answer it. And these aren't questions like, hey, is the color of your headset going to be blue or green? These are questions like, what are the inclusion and exclusion criteria of your study? What is your demographic within that study? How many people will you study? What's the power analysis that you did? How are you going to make this safe? Are the electronics available to everyone? Do you want this to be software as a medical device or software in a medical device? Those are all kinds of questions that they can ask. And while you're answering, guess what? The clock is stopped. Man, it got quiet because that clock stops. And sometimes the clock can stop because some of these will require clinical evidence. So you actually have to run a study or something, or you have to be close to concluding that study. Because the length of time given for you to respond, the maximal time in a regulatory filing is 180 days. So that's 6 months. So if you're close to your end of your clinical trial and you think you can have the results and the results are going to answer the question, then okay. But if you're not going to make it, guess what? You have to withdraw your application or they will do it for you if you don't have it answered in 180 days. So again, we really went over 120 already, didn't we? So it's a little tough. It's a little tough. But the biggest thing that when we look at statistics from the FDA, and they get close, they'll give us some, but they're only looking at those de novo submissions that were granted. So there's still a lot in the pipeline that have these long extended timelines, but we don't get to know about them until they get granted. And if they never get granted, we don't know how long they sat there and how long they went through the process. And so only 21 de novo requests were granted in 2019. The average timeline is 307 calendar days. AVR was a star, 231 days for authorization for AVR. Now, this is one of those PowerPoint rule breakers. It's a busy slide. But I put it in here because I want you to see some concepts and some terms. So this goes through the phases of when you're thinking about your device or your application. This here, begin DHF. DHF is a design history file. And that tells the regulator that you know every single step. You've verified and validated and tested every part of that device. And you did that from the very beginning. Now, many people don't know that down here, once you get cleared, you have to have a DHF. But if you know that at the very beginning of the process, then you start putting those things in place. You start following the rules before you're told to follow the rules. So when it's time to follow the rules, you're really good at it. So this takes every part of your organization to understand that now everything that you do in developing your product is going to be under scrutiny. Because it is not if you're going to be audited by the FDA, it is when you're going to be audited by the FDA. And they're going to ask you, how did you know that this particular verbiage in your voiceover would have this effect? And you have to say, we verified and validated through this process. And if you didn't write it down and memorialize it, it didn't happen. So knowing that from the very beginning, when you start to look at feasibility of your product, that makes things much, much easier for you. Then let's look here. You got to do a risk assessment because that defines what classification your device is. Class 1, like a tongue depressor. So not much regulatory stuff there. Or low risk. And low risk is kind of a gray term because we think that VR, in most cases, is low risk. There's low risk to the patient. You can get out of the environment just by taking the headset off. It's not implanted. You don't swallow it or anything like that. But in FDA parlance, risk is about the benefit and everything that's involved in making that product. So since it's headgear, since there's electronics in it, and since it's going to be on a person, that elevates the risk to what we call a class 2. And you have to do a risk assessment, so you have to look at everything that could go wrong with your device and tell the impact of that, and then grade how that impacts the patient and your risk analysis. So every time you think about bringing something to market, these are all the things that you have to think about. And guess what? You don't have to do them by yourself. There's consultants, there's people like me that, I'm not a consultant, but that went to like regulatory school because I didn't have enough to do as an orthopedic surgeon, to understand how to define risk, how to assess risk, and then how to disseminate the information about risk. Because that's what you have to convey to the FDA, that the benefit outweighs the risk of your device. So all those things that you learned about pitch competitions and things like that, that's another one that you have to get ready for is the FDA. You have to pitch them. They probably wouldn't like me saying that, but that's the way you have to think about it. You have to convince them. But all of these things happen throughout this process. And so I really just wanted you to begin here by saying we're going to be a medical device. So we have to do things differently than we did before. That's the biggest takeaway here. So this is a regular timeline of a proposed 510K submission. So they have 7 days to look at your application. By day 15, they have to tell you whether they accepted it or they sent you one of those RTAs and stopped the clock or not. And then from there, they have 60 days to do the initial review. And within that first 60 days is where you might have what's called an AI, so the request for additional information. And that blue box down there is that 180 days that could happen while you're answering that question. And then at the end of that, wherever that was, because to them, it's day 60, or it's right before day 60. And when the clock starts again after you're 108, so 6 months later, you're still at day 60. And then once you get all your answers in, they have till day 90 or 120, depending on which pathway you're in, to provide their review and response. So this is AVR's pathway. So they had the idea for the product in 2015 and started with some feasibility studies. And then in 2018, did another clinical trial. And the biggest thing is they knew that they wanted to be a regulated medical device. And in order to do that, they knew they were going to have to provide clinical evidence. But this is called a Q-sub. This is where you can go to the FDA and say, here's what we think will demonstrate safety and effectiveness of our product through this clinical trial. Do you agree? Now, they will never say, yes, we agree totally, because then you can hold them to it and you can say, hey, I did what you said, and they will say, that really sounds like a good idea. Do it and we'll let you know. But this is an opportunity for you to find out what they're thinking. And they went through the process, continued their work and building a body of clinical evidence and in 2020, and finally received their de novo submission on November 16th of 2021. So from 2015 to 2021 are all the things that had to happen to get to FDA authorization. So that's pretty cool. And then what happens after life after breakthrough? So again, they got a single indication, because an indication means that you have demonstrated safety and effectiveness for every claim that you want to make. So they wanted to make the claim of treating chronic lower back pain, very specific. So they designed a clinical trial to demonstrate the safety and effectiveness in chronic lower back pain. But we're continuing to do clinical research to build a body of evidence because we want to make additional claims. And the other side of that is there's limited commercial penetration into the market right now because there was no reimbursement. But, so I had to turn this in before we got the good news that we have a HCPCS code. So we went to CMS, and now there's a code. Whenever you go to the doctor, you used to walk out with that little sheet and they had a circle on it and said what the doctor got paid. Now we have a code that can go on that little sheet. So doctors can get paid. We're still in the process. It's a long process to do what they call, so now we have to do pricing of that. So CMS has to decide the value of our code. But that was another hurdle. So that took us 8 months after the application to get that HCPCS code granted. And we were another special case because our expert in health economics says it usually doesn't come through on the first try. And we got it on the first try. But that's all about the story that you tell too. So remember that. It's all about the story that you tell as well. And I put this in here because it's going to be critically important that everyone doing work in this space publish. Because the FDA has made it and has designed a guidance document that says that we can use real-world evidence. So not everybody has to design a clinical trial from scratch. Let's use what's out there. But we don't have a lot of data in this space comparably to pharmaceutical research. And the other interesting thing is it is now going to be required that all clinical trials have a diversity of demographics within those trials in order to be considered for FDA clearance. So in every population that you're studying, make sure you publish, because that body of evidence will help us to accelerate getting innovative products to market. So what are we doing now? We continue to do a double-blind, randomized controlled trial, health economics and outcomes research, because we have to demonstrate the value of these products to patients and payers. So the health economics piece of this is going to tell us how using VR actually impacts the bottom line of patients and providers. And so additionally, we are proposing to use information from that clinical trial to expand indications. So we have over 1,000 people with lots of comorbid conditions. And hopefully we can see how this intervention impacts throughout and across multiple indications. But we'll have to go through that process again. So this is the final, well, I have a couple slides for resources, but this is just to remind you of this process. So you turn in your application. You have 7 days. Between day 15, if you get one of those RTAs, the clock stops. Then you're in your 60-day review. But if you have additional questions, the clock stops. And then at that 90-day to 120 days, that is when the FDA submission comes. MDUFA is that 100, so MDUFA 4 was 100 days, MDUFA 5 is now, which was recently ratified, is 120 days, and that's the incentive for the FDA to hurry up and review your submission. And then you get 510K clearance or the de novo. So what are we doing now? Just spoiled it. We got our HCPCS code, and we are waiting for a decision from the FDA. So we're on that continuum now of that. They asked us some additional questions. So we're on that continuum now. And this is a great YouTube produced by the FDA staff that talks about regulatory science, what they're doing, and how can you interact with them. And this is the Office of Scientific and Engineering Laboratories, and it's kind of a think tank and where you can go and ask very specific questions about how can you get your product to market, what's the best route, do you need clinical evidence, without having to start a huge paperwork flow with the FDA, but at the same time interacting and educating the FDA. Any questions? Thank you so much.